Howdy again everyone, and let's get straight into testing out the new Nikon Z 28-75mm f2.8. It's a fast standard zoom lens that is only for their Z mount mirrorless camera system, and it offers a full frame field of view. Nikon are marketing this as being a more affordable standard zoom lens for their system at a price of $1,200 in the US or £950 here in the UK. I'd question that, but it certainly is a lot less than their 24-70mm f2.8 option, while keeping that nice bright maximum aperture and maintaining a similar zoom range, although some will miss that extra 4mm at the wide angle end. I'd like to thank Nikon UK for loaning me a sample copy of this lens for a couple of weeks for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. The lens is mostly made of plastic, so it's not the highest level of quality that Nikon currently offer, but it does actually feel solid enough. At 565 grams it has a little weight to it, but it's hardly a strain to use. The lens is built upon a metal lens mount with a generous weather sealing gasket. In front of that comes a customizable control dial. You can set it in your camera to control your aperture, your exposure compensation, your ISO sensitivity, or you can disable it altogether. When shooting in manual focus mode, it acts as a focus ring. It works with the lens's focus motor a little bit slowly but precisely. Some good news is that this lens exhibits only a little focus breathing whether you're zoomed in or zoomed out, so this would be quite a usable lens for video work. The lens's autofocus motor works silently, accurately, and at an averagely fast speed. The lens's zoom ring is large and rubberized. It too turns very smoothly without any stickiness to it. The lens comes with a slightly cheap feeling plastic hood. Its front filter size is 67mm wide, and it does not feature image stabilization, although Nikon's full frame cameras currently all have image stabilization built in. Overall, the build quality here is perfectly fine, although compared to Nikon's higher grade S series of lenses, the plastic lens body might make you feel slightly shortchanged for $1,200 US. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at image quality. I'm testing this lens on a Nikon Z7 camera with its full frame 45 megapixel sensor. In-camera corrections are turned on. In the middle of the image from 28mm and f2.8, we see fantastic sharpness and contrast. Let's take a look at the image corners, and they look noticeably soft. Stop down to f4, f5.6 and f8 for gradual improvements that lead to very good sharpness, although contrast is still a bit low in those corners. Let's zoom in to 50mm. At f2.8, again, we see excellent image quality in the middle. Over in the corners, image quality isn't as soft as it was at 28mm, but it's still not great. At f4, we see more contrast in the corners. At f5.6, a little more sharpness, but that is as sharp as those corners get, even if you stop down the aperture further. And finally, let's zoom all the way into 75mm. At f2.8, once again, we see excellent sharpness and contrast in the middle. Once again, in the corners, we see a softer image, although they're a bit sharper than at wider angles. Stop down to f4 for a little more brightness and contrast, and at f5.6, we see just a touch more sharpness. The image stays this sharp until you stop down to about f11. At f16, a little softness begins to creep in due to the effects of diffraction. Overall, this lens is always razor sharp in the middle of your images. The corner image quality is something else though. It's never terribly soft, but you will need to zoom in and stop down your aperture a bit for sharp image corners. Okay, well, let's turn off in-camera corrections and look at distortion and vignetting. At 28mm and f2.8, we see moderate barrel distortion and pretty heavy vignetting right in the edges of your image. Stop down to f4 and f5.6 for those corners to quickly brighten up. Zoom into 30mm and that distortion straightens out. Zoom all the way into 75mm and that distortion flips into a moderate pincushion distortion, and vignetting continues to be pretty ugly at f2.8. Again, at f4 and f5.6, those corners quickly brighten up again. So we see a normal level of vignetting for a lens of this kind, but actually a little less distortion than normal. This lens's minimum focus distance is 39 centimeters when zooming in, getting you really nice and close to smaller subjects. When shooting close up at f2.8, contrast is reduced and just a hint of purple fringing becomes visible, but sharpness continues to be very high. Stop down to f4 for a huge increase in sharpness and f5.6 for a completely clean image. Let's see now how the lens works against bright light. At wide angles, as you can see, flaring isn't really much of an issue. Zoom in and it gets a little stronger, but still, I have seen worse than this before. Next up, bokeh. With that bright maximum aperture of f2.8, you can get some nicely out of focus backgrounds with this lens. Very strong out of focus points of light, do see a little outlining here, but overall the lens's bokeh looks nice and soft to me. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f2.8 we see some yellow colour fringing on bokeh highlights before the plane of focus and blue after the plane of focus. Stop down to f4 and it's still there but reduced. At f5.6 though it's pretty much gone. Overall then, well, this is a great lens for video work where it handles fantastically well, but I can't quite recommend blowing $1,200 on it for stills photography if sharpness is your priority. Its image corners just aren't quite what they should be. Other aspects of its image quality are perfectly good though. Some people have speculated on whether this is actually a licensed copy of an older Tamron lens, the original Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 for Sony E-mount cameras, as the two lenses seem to have the same optical formula. Indeed, the two lenses do have similarities in sharpness and distortion levels. However, according to my tests, the Nikon lens has better contrast, particularly when you're zoomed in, and far more pleasant looking bokeh. And the Tamron lens can focus a bit more closely to your subject, so there are some differences. Ultimately, if you are on the market for a Nikon standard zoom lens, then I would recommend the fantastic new 24-120mm f4 instead, which is actually one of my favourite zoom lenses of all time and even a little bit cheaper. But video makers might prefer this 28-75mm lens, not least because of its brighter aperture. Well, I hope you find these reviews helpful. I certainly enjoy putting them together for you all. They will always be on YouTube and they will always be totally free to watch. If you'd like to support this channel and keep these videos coming, then check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below and supporters get all kinds of bonus content. Ciao for now.